All right, welcome everybody to this roundtable on trust and social conflict. My name is Tobias Wille. I'm the scientific coordinator and also a PI at the ConTrust initiative, and a very great pleasure to chair this conversation here. Let me begin by briefly introducing our roundtable participants. We have, and I'll just move through the panel without it having any particular meaning, with Sally Scholz, who is a professor of philosophy at Villanova University. Her work is in the area of social and political philosophy. And amongst others, she has been writing about political solidarity, publishing also a very well-received book on the topic with Penn State University Press. And she also has worked as a philosopher on peacemaking. So I think she's also really exactly the right person for us to talk about the relationship of trust and conflict. And we just had a little conversation about it. And Sally said it's so important because philosophers can contribute something there. And I 100% agree. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about trust and conflict. And Sally also is a visiting fellow here at ConTrust. And so it's great to have you here for the whole term and also tonight for this roundtable. Then we have Jan Delhey, who is professor of sociology at Magdeburg University and there holds the chair for macro sociology. He's an expert on trust, on social capital, and on social cohesion. And he's also an important voice in the debate on happiness and quality of life. So he's one of these Glücksforscher, well sought after by the German media, even though he just told me that, in fact, he can't tell you how to lead a happy life. He has written a large number of articles published in leading journals in sociology on trust and its importance for social cohesion. And so he's exactly also the right person to talk to today for us, of course. And so it's really great to have such a distinguished empirical trust researcher amongst us. Welcome. Then we have Clara Weinhardt, who is an assistant professor in international relations at Maastricht University. She works on global governance with a particular focus on trade policy, on North-South relations, and has published some articles in leading journals of IR, but I here just want to highlight one publication, which is an article in the Journal of Trust Research on the role of trust in North-South trade relations. And last, but certainly not least, we have Thomas Biebricher on this roundtable, who is an associate professor in the Department of Management, Politics and Philosophy at the Copenhagen Business School, and also a PI in our ConTrust initiative here. He's a political theorist who has worked on neoliberalism, the decline of conservatism and populism, to name just a couple of the topics he's worked on. And just to highlight one of his publications, recently appeared with Stanford University Press, The Political Theory of Neoliberalism, which just these days was published in Germany, the translation with the Surkamp. So welcome, Thomas. All right, so what I want to do is first pose a couple of questions to our roundtable and get a little conversation started up here. And then I want to open it up and invite you, the audience, all to come in and participate in this conversation. So as you all know, and this as was also repeatedly mentioned in the welcome notes from our Minister of Education and our President, the particular twist of ConTrust is, of course, that we want to conceive of trust not as the opposite or maybe also an antidote to conflict, but really as a dynamic element in the unfolding of conflicts. And against that background, I and I'm sure everybody here would be really interested in hearing how you conceive of the relationship between trust and conflict in your own research. And I really would like to hear all of your takes on this, of course, but I would like to start with Sally. So this is a question for you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And I'm so honored to be invited to be part of the panel and to hear the conversation. And I very much appreciate the question and the opportunity to reflect together. I work on political solidarity, and this is in particular, I'm interested in other forms of solidarity as well, but political solidarity is at least related to those social movements that arise in conflict, and in conflict in particular with the social structures that are perceived or actually are oppressive, tyrannical, and unjust. And one of the interesting things from my perspective about political solidarity is that these are intentional communities. It's an opportunity to engage in contentious politics, but to do it in a very intentional manner, and very often in forming the solidarities, the community will actually embrace principles that that challenge directly the systems of injustice and oppression. And so in doing that, they often are quite deliberate about how they handle conflict, and that conflict has to be part of our contentious community. Our disagreement has to be part of who we are as a solidaristic group, and we have to work through ways of dealing with this disagreement. So I think you can see this, for instance, within, I've done work on Occupy Wall Street, the feminist movement, peace movements, and now Black Lives Matter too. And there's a real deliberate focus on how do we create community that opposes what we challenge, the structures of injustice, while also recreating a new system, a new structure without what we oppose. So that's part of it. I also, in looking at political solidarities, being together as participants in political solidarity, it entails risk. And I think trust is a corollary concept to risk, as is vulnerability. But maybe we can talk more about that later. I don't want to take too much time, so we'll start there.
Thanks. I mean, it's also kind of a warm-up question, so I think we leave it there for the moment and come back to it later. So then the same question for you, Jan.
Yeah, thank you also for the invitation to be part of this panel here. I also like very much your general approach to say that trust is not a priori the opposite, or distrust is not a priori the opposite to conflict-free society. However, I think what we need to consider is the strength of conflicts. And here I want to draw on my own research I did. It's an older paper from 2008, where we looked for the European populations on the relationship between trust and the perception of conflicts. And for trust, it was the general trust question: do you trust most people? What we heard also in the keynote speak just before. And we had a couple of questions about perception of conflict. So distributive conflicts, conflict between ethnic groups, between men and women. And the respondents had three options to answer how strong they perceive these three conflicts. No tensions, some tensions, and a lot of tensions. So a very simple three-part answer. And the results were really intriguing because those respondents who saw some conflicts, that was not detrimental to their trust in most people. But those respondents who perceived a lot of tensions in society, that was detrimental to trust. So there seems to be, as a kind of general rule, that some conflict is no problem for trust, but too much conflict might be a problem for trust. So you've asked about the relationship between trust and conflicts. So from my work, I would say it's neutral at best, and in some cases it's a negative relationship.
So you would say we need the right dose of conflict to sustain trust? The right dose of conflict, and it might work, but basically if conflicts spiral out of control, then we might get into trouble.
Exactly. So as long as the conflict is kind of tamed, so that it's not too strong, it seems not to be a problem for the social cohesion of society, and also trust and other positive attitudes. But too strong conflicts obviously pose a problem. So yeah.
So definitely something we need to come back to later, also when we talk about where the biggest political and social problems are, of course, because I mean, this almost already leads, of course, to a diagnosis of a problem of our time. May I also pose this question to you, Clara? Where do you see the relationship between trust and conflict or how do you see that in your own work?
First of all, also thank you very much from my side for this invitation. And as a disclaimer, I must say that the role of trust in my research is probably reflective of the role of trust in my discipline, international relations. It remains a bit marginalized. So the general assumption is that we look at the level of international politics, states don't have much reason to trust each other. The way in which trust entered my research agenda is that I look at global trade and I look at negotiation processes. So here in the end, we don't have states sitting at the negotiation table, but individuals. And here I found that it does matter whether or not they do have a trusting or mistrusting relationship. And I looked at EU-Africa trade negotiations and EU-Africa and Caribbean trade negotiations. And what I found striking is that the same negotiation behavior from the European side was perceived as problematic and led to mistrust in the West African case, but wasn't perceived as part of a conflict on the Caribbean side. And when it comes to the relationship between conflict and trust, the general premise was to say that, well, if there is mistrusting behavior in a situation of uncertainty that certainly characterizes negotiation settings, it can help to overcome conflicts and facilitate a cooperative outcome, whereas mistrust can do the opposite. But the way in which I approached it conceptually was drawing more on social psychological research that looks at identification-based trust. So if there's a high level of identification between the negotiators, this kind of constitutes trust because it reassures negotiation partners that they pursue common goals. And this is what I found was present in the Caribbean case. So here, when it comes to the relationship between trust and conflict, in a way, this trusting basis made this negotiation pairing much more resilient to conflicts because they weren't even perceived maybe as conflict when the EU was like tough and not willing to give in and being very rigid. This was not perceived as a problem because there was this reassurance. This is a trade game. We're at an equal level playing this trade game, whereas in the West African side, there was much more the expectation that the European side is maybe playing a paternalistic game, but should also give some handouts and pay more attention to the unequal power relation between the parties.
Fantastic. And to complete this first round of questions, Thomas, so you're the part of ConTrust. You are PI here, so you better stick to our narrative, I guess. But I still want to pose this question to you. Where in your research do you see kind of interesting relations between trust and conflict?
Yeah, well, it is true. I have really internalized the agenda of ConTrust, and so I'll be a little redundant here and emphasize once more that I think what stands out as a characteristic of our agenda is really not to think of conflict and trust as a zero-sum relation. And I just want to draw out some implications from that and point to some of the reasons. I mean, one reason is certainly sort of the phenomenological, but also the conceptual reason that we see that trust sometimes can be seen as justified or founded only at a moment when conflict arises. And conflict can be really the moment when renewed trust can arise, when conflict can be resolved. So that is one of the links that I think we tend to agree on. That is an important reason for conceptualizing like that. But there's also, I think, a political reason for that was hinted at before. Some of the research that thinks of trust and conflict as a zero-sum relation assumes that therefore diverse and therefore more conflict-prone communities, for example, are also to some extent therefore deficient in terms of their trust levels. There's some research in the tradition of Robert Putnam and so on and so forth that would emphasize that. And then sometimes that leads you down a relatively conservative road where the thrust of this research suggests that we should have more homogeneous political communities and so on and so forth. And that doesn't strike me as a very plausible diagnosis. And therefore, we want to have certain kinds of conflicts. And that leads me to the third implication that I think hasn't been mentioned before, so that's a good thing. And that refers to the component of conflict, really, because I think if I understand the agenda correctly, then and I'll be, told if I don't, I guess. If I understand it correctly, then really this is not about searching for trust that can be generated even in constellations of conflict to overcome these conflicts, but rather really see this as a dialectic and as a balance that needs to be found, and view trust as a resource to keep certain conflicts going, actually, and to be able to engage in these kinds of conflicts. That seems like a rather, maybe a little radical implication, but that's the way I see it, because, I mean, we want certain conflicts to go on, democratic contestations, for example, and trust, certain kinds of trust, certain levels of trust would enable these conflicts to go on and not to get out of hand. And something similar could be said for example, when you think about economics, conflicts there would involve competition. A lot of people would say we need competition, but it has to be sort of reined in by trust. And so that's the aspect that I'm interested in, and particularly, but that's not what we focus on today. I guess maybe we'll get to it later, how all of this is impacted by conditions of uncertainty. That's really what I'm interested in most.
Yeah. I'll definitely get back to that later. So like doing the Frankfurt thing and seeing a dialectic there is, of course, fully on brand as well. What I might want to add to this is that it's not just trust, but it's also distrust, of which we need to write those to work through conflicts in a productive way. And I think this is also kind of the engaged distrust Mark Warren was talking about. We basically need the engaged trust, which kind of, not every kind of trust, as we heard and as we all know, is necessarily good for the management on containment of conflicts. And the same, I think, is true for distrust. So you get a second dialectic there, I guess, between distrust, possibly also mistrust and trust. All right, fantastic. So I think we have a lot of interesting, well, first of all, context of research and also context of conflict, of course, you're all working on the table here. And a lot of interesting questions that come with it. And so I want to unpack that a bit more by focusing on what trust exactly means and does in these contexts. And also in the research projects, of course, you are and have been working on. And there are many options to understand trust. Man can understand trust as a rational expectation that somebody else will behave in a kind of cooperative or benevolent way. But on the other hand, also trust, of course, quite often seems to be more than that, a true leap of faith, a proper commitment we enter without knowing what will happen. And then, of course, we also have kind of this affective emotional dimension that quite often trust is something we feel and not just something we decide to give to somebody. And so there are many options to think about trust. And they all have implications for how we understand conflict and their unfolding. And so this is something I want to talk a bit more about with you. And I want to go back to Sally first and ask you a question. So in your work on political solidarity, right? Groups are very important in the relationships the members of political movements have to each other. So they're committed to a cause, they're committed to each other. And as a philosopher, you also, of course, would emphasize that this kind of generates moral obligations and all of that. Mm-hmm. And so I was really wondering about the role trust plays here. So what do members of social movements do if they decide to trust each other, or if they give each other trust? And so, of course, there might be something rational about it in the sense that they have shared goals and they need to coordinate. But there might also be something more there. So it's possibly it's a moral decision that is not instrumentally rational. It's not rational in the sense of means-ends relations. Might also be an emotional commitment or possibly expression of an identity or even of an aspiration who one wants to be. And so I was really wondering what your thoughts are on the role of trust in the social movements you work on.
Yeah, good. Well, I think it's a really challenging question, and partly we need to take into account the context of the specific movement as well, because the goals of the movement will, I think, very often mediate the sorts of relationships that people expect from one another within the movement. And not every social movement would be characterized by solidarity, I would add as well. But for instance, I wouldn't say that the actors of January 6th in the United States were a solidaristic group, but we'll put that aside for now. Within solidarities, political solidarities, I think you also, or one sees an analysis of different axes of trust, and those fall along also lines of power. And so part of what the task is within solidarity is to scrutinize our own occupation of positions of power and how that may make me vulnerable in certain positions or powerful in others. Once we assess that position of power, though, then in taking the risk in solidarity with others, part of what we're doing is also saying, oh, I'm willing to lend my power to this cause. And so the risk is a sort of shared willingness grounded in an expectation or trust that others will also share this willingness, and that our collective action together will be better or bring out more just outcomes or advance the goal than if we were to act separately. So it's a risking of our togetherness and trusting that others will also take that plunge, jump in and accept that risk. But I think it has to be with a conscious awareness of power and vulnerability along the way. So there is a rational assessment and a constant reflection on power.
And I assume you would also say it's reasonable. It's just that it's kind of also risky and open, and the participants in a social movement don't know for sure, and also probably can't pin a probability on the likelihood that the others will reciprocate.
So I want to say yes to all of that, but I also recognize that many of us are pulled into social movements without even a conscious awareness. But our commitment is there in our affect, in our lived reality. So or in our experience.
Yeah.
So I think there is a reasonable side, but I think there has to be an affective side as well.
Yeah, one can imagine, for example, in like being together, arguing about things, but also probably marching together, something like that, that probably also produces trust in a kind of effective way.
Exactly, and I think we see within solidarity groups that can we call them embodied forms of protest?
Yeah.
That those are creative ways of nurturing trust too. When we see someone willing to cross a line, or climb a fence to help close a school or something like that, that puts them bodily at risk, or march, right? Then they are engendering a sort of confidence from others that can permeate to other relationships as well, or could just stay with that particular form of activism.
Yeah.
So
yeah, fascinating, and I think exactly the right point also to bring in Jan. So in your work, of course, group dynamics play a big role, and kind of identity conceptions in groups and out groups and all of that. And of course, when we talk about these identities and their relationship to trust, affect, emotions also need to play a certain role. And so we'd be really interested in your thoughts on to what extent in social conflicts we need to understand trust as something rational, and to what extent is possibly something non-rational, irrational, or even affective.
That's a very tough question, because usually I do not approach the issue of trust and conflicts the way you do, because you look at different conflicts parties, if I understood it correctly, and ask yourself, how is it possible to develop trust within that conflictual situation, right? So when I approach trust, I typically deal with this trust in most people. So trust as a very general stance to see strangers. And so this reduces in a kind of way the situation to the respondents and his own endowment with resources and his own experiences. and the wider social context he lived in. So this is a little bit an easier constellation to do trust research. However, in my own research, the kind of papers which come close to your setting is the research I did on dyadic trust between nations. So how much do the Germans trust the French and vice versa? Because here you have the two groups of people, the two collectivities with their characteristics of the trustee, of the potential trusted group or distrusted group, and you have a third element, the relationship between this group, the actual relationships, kind of, I don't know, trade relations and so on, how many people are visiting each other, but also, of course, the whole historical experience of alliances or wars. And I think coming back to your question, I guess the kind of information which are processed when people form trust or distrust, they refer to both to cognitions and to emotions, I guess. And especially in situation like yours, when there is a clearly described counterpart who will be trusted or distrusted. I guess in this situation in particular, we try to get or collect facts about other persons or the other group, but also, of course, we have our stereotypes, we have our emotional impressions. We like some group, we dislike some group. Sometimes we cannot tell why, so it's not wholly entirely a rational thing. So I would say it's kind of these both informations are processed. So rational cognitions, but also emotions. And I would say therefore that the approach you choose should be flexible enough to consider both sources of information. So I would not go for a kind of rational choice explanation for this, because I think it will not serve your purpose.
Yeah, so this is an interesting contrast to obviously the more theoretical and philosophical approach, which kind of commits to a framework how to understand trust. And what I hear and what you're saying is that as an empirical researcher, you're also quite open for what you actually find, what the motivations are that actually get people to develop trust, and probably also articulate it in your surveys and possibly interviews and so on. I mean, one thing that's really interesting, and I think also something that could be developed then in this interdisciplinary discourse we really want to get started here, is also how the societal level you were talking about, how basically members of the public in different states, how they conceive other members of publics of other states, how that actually translates into interstate relations, which is even philosophically a very complicated problem, but empirically possibly even more to actually untangle that. And now people will start to see why I lined you up in that way. It's also, of course, a question that really preoccupies us IR scholars. And so I wanted to ask you, Clara, a particular question about these interstate relations at this aggregate level. So you introduced basically your interest in this problem by referring to the old anarchy problematic in IR, right? So international politics is this realm of anarchy where everybody kind of is doing this very cold calculus, everybody is very rational. And then you said, well, but in your research, the assumption of trust that would follow from that trust really is kind of just a rational expectation how the others will behave, that kind of is informed by past observations of their behavior and possibly also knowledge about the setting in which one interacts, that just didn't really work for you, and that you then developed this notion of relational trust, you call it. And so I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more kind of what this more is that the relational bit brings to the otherwise fairly kind of cold calculus many people think dominates international politics.
That's also a big question. Thanks.
Only a big question. No.
I mean, maybe I start that I'm also not ruling out that there are rational understandings of trust that can be useful. I mean, especially when looking at negotiation settings, as I was doing. Of course, strategic calculation and lack of information about the other side's true red lines and true intentions is always there. So there will always be risk assessments about, okay, what's the other side likely to do based on past experiences, based on information I have. So this is always going to take place in any kind of negotiation setting. But I arrived at trust rather inductively, I would say, through conducting interviews with these trade negotiators and realizing the stories they were telling me were not so much just about these risk assessments, what's really the intention of the other side, or what is the red line and what are the consequences of my action, but there were these rich stories about like resentment, about the way in which the other side behaved, the lack of distrust, but then also contrasted by the depictions of this is a friendly relationship we have developed. And this really struck me that there are these aspects that are in part formed by the relationship between the actors at the negotiation table that, of course, I would say have a bit more of an emotional affective dimension. So it's not just a cognitive process to it that do and shape also the negotiation outcomes. And I think this is something that is missed in a rationalist conception, which usually tries to look at the situation structure. So what information is there, what interests are there, and what risks do the sides perceive, and then is it warranted rationally to trust the other side based on this information? And I think what we lose is that also these trusting relationships are embedded in the larger histories in the state relation, and then added on top of that, the particular history of the interaction at the negotiation table between the states. And of course, looking at trade negotiations between the former colonial power and former colonies, this was a theme that came up in the West African side's perceptions of the US mistrust for that there were some echoes of this colonial past, but this was also because it was framed in that way. So I feel like if we take the identity conceptions and make them part of the picture, they are not just like a factor that maybe increases or decreases trust, but they can really constitute trustful or not so trustful relationships to start with. And then, of course, they evolve based on the interactions at the negotiation table or whatever the setting is where they interact.
So, which, of course, is also, at least for kind of a social scientist who want to disentangle that, it's kind of a tricky problem, because these past experiences that then basically form identities, I mean, they're not all present at once, but they kind of selectively get activated, I suppose. So definitely an intriguing problem. Want to say a bit about how you would go about basically identifying those, or how do we know when we see them?
One thing to add on what you just said, I think here the individual also comes in. So from the Caribbean side, there was this high level of identification, but I think it was also partly due to the constitution of the negotiation team, which was a team of like highly skilled, Western-oriented trade negotiators, which could have been a different story if there would have been other people at the negotiation table. And yes, the methodology part is super tricky, which is maybe also why this part of research remains a little bit marginal to my research agenda, because it is very tricky to determine the levels of trust of like elite actors, even especially if you cannot sit in the conflict setting. So I borrowed a couple of methods also from social psychology, but yeah, you run into problems when it comes to large N numbers. So one thing I, for instance, did is to look at identification-based trust. What social psychology does in surveys is to simply ask the participants if they choose among a number of graphics that are just two circles. And the first one is like apart, and then there are several ones where it gets closer, and the last one, it's just identical. It's just ask the participants, how do you describe the relationship with the other side? And this I did use with my negotiation with the interview partners, but of course it was small n. But it really struck me that it was also the way that the Caribbean negotiators were much more inclined to picture the relationship with the European Union as like really overlapping circles, whereas the negotiators from the West African side really also, they are pictured it differently. But it is very challenging to apply it in such a highly constrained setting.
Yeah, and
it remains a bit anecdotal.
Well, but it also kind of led you to basically import insights from other disciplines and think about it kind of in this interdisciplinary way, which is also what we will try to do in this project, or are already engaged in doing. Thomas, I promised we would get back to uncertainty, and now we will. So and I think this is, as you said already, is quite central in your work. And there's the obvious link to trust, that if we would know for sure what the others will do, we will not need to trust them. So uncertainty, of course, is linked to it, but also the relationship is much more profound, because basically the deeper the uncertainty is, the more trust we need. But at the same time, the more speculative the trust gets, and the more of a leap of faith, and that's possibly also harder actually to generate or to give. And also, obviously, if one fails and the uncertainty is just overwhelming, then we are probably just paralyzed and can't act anymore. And so I wanted to ask you to reflect a bit, of course, on this relationship between trust and uncertainty, and possibly also in relationship to your actual work, of course, on economic, well, basically on the economy, but also the history of thought on economics.
Yeah, I think you mentioned already a couple of things. I mean, I subscribe to a distinction between a world of risk and a world of uncertainty, genuinely understood, and the world of risk. And therefore, I'm not entirely sure if it's the complete correlate of trust, really, or at the very least, I think that would be the correlate of, I think, a more rational form of trust, where we talk about risk assessment and so on and so forth. Risk is subject to a certain degree, at least, to rational calculation, and we have techniques and technologies of risk assessment that are sometimes very refined and very sophisticated, and so there's less need to trust there, I think. It is in moments of uncertainty and in realms of uncertainty, I think, where we are pushed into having to trust, really, because this is the world of nonlinear developments. It's the world of tipping points and so on and so forth. And people who do work on this tend to say the realms of where uncertainty reigns is politics, economics, and pandemics, by the way. So it's very apropos, I guess. So what happens is that in these moments, to a certain degree, trust collapses in established frameworks of understanding things. In moments of crisis, for example, that happens. And then the question is, what is the basis of your course of action, right? And that means, you know, there's trust required, that is shifted to somewhere else, to some other person. Who do you trust in moments of uncertainty, when the experts say, well, we don't know really, because this is a unique situation, for example, in crises where we're not entirely sure about our path forwards. And I guess you turn to authorities, I think. And I think the term already hints at what I think happens there, is that our forms of trust become a little less reflected, maybe also a little less rational, because it's not entirely clear why somebody is an authority or something, you know. It's mostly about projecting an air of knowing what to do in a certain moment and how to defend the population and so on and so forth. But I think in these moments, there's a certain tendency maybe for a more possibly a rational form of trust that has no basis, because there is just no basis to come to the fore. And I think, especially in the history of economic thought and political thought, it's always moments of crises when this comes to the fore. Really.
So to relate that through these diagnosis that Jan was already hinting at. Do you see a particular risk in heightened conflict also, that this dynamic might kick in, that that the uncertainty the conflict itself generates might have this effect?
Well, I think not necessarily. I think that has very much to do with the context. I think to some extent one could say that some people who do work on uncertainty would argue that possibly the best way of becoming resilient in the face of uncertainty is actually, and that goes back to what I said initially, is actually to let a certain level of conflict reign actually, and not to try to do away with it too much.
So we're back at the idea of the right dose of conflict for kind of productive trust dynamics, which we should definitely keep in mind and then continue probing as this project moves forward. So what I wanted to do now is actually pose kind of a third general question to the panel, and invite you to reflect a bit on where you see in terms now of research that is politically and socially relevant, fields where you see the biggest challenges basically for trust to productively kind of engage with conflict, or also possibly the largest potential for trust if nurtured in the right way to actually do some good. But because we're really kind of already far advanced in the little time we have, I actually want to first open it up, invite the audience to come in and pose questions, and then if we go through the panel again with the responses, I want to also invite you then to reflect a bit on so where the trust research and also kind of the right politics of trust is most needed these days. So that's the invitation to all of you to pose questions, and also to everyone who is following us on Zoom. And we have this very sophisticated logistics so that I can actually see that you have a question.